day in, day out, to stand before you and come together as a group in a time of great tragedy for each of them. It has been 172 days since Hamas's brutal October 7th terrorist attack. Sorry, 182, I'm sorry. It's been 182 days since Hamas's brutal October 7th terrorist attack against Israel. When terrorists went door to door, murdering men, women, and children, 1,200 indiscriminately. The worst mass murder of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. Make no mistake, this was Israel's 9/11. But for many of the families gathered here today, this was only the beginning of a long nightmare. More than 240 people were taken hostage by those terrorists. And over 100 of them remain in the captivity of Hamas today. At least 32 American citizens were murdered by Hamas on October 7th. At least half a dozen remain in terrorist hands. The men and women gathered with us today are family members of these American citizens who were taken prisoner or murdered by Hamas. When I went to Israel in the aftermath of October 7th and watched in horror a 21-minute video, raw footage, unedited, of the terrorist attack of that day, you saw the glee with which these terrorists indiscriminately killed Jews. You saw the joy with which they murdered innocent civilians, and the horror as they kidnapped and held hostage innocent Israelis and Americans. I have had the honor of meeting with these families on many occasions now, including having the Nutra family as guests at the State of the Union to hear from President Biden. They have suffered, all of these families. And as we now have endured 6 months since this attack, it is critically important to ensure that the hostages are at the forefront of these discussions. As Israel defends itself, and I support their right to defend themselves and prosecute the war against a terrorist group, the focus must be on releasing all of the hostages. Not a handful, but all. And so any talk of a ceasefire must include the release of the hostages. Any talk of humanitarian assistance must include the release of the hostages. They cannot be decoupled. They cannot be separated out. These families have suffered enough. And so, what I am asking for, as the President and the administration continue to negotiate with Qatar, with Egypt, with Israel, to try and get terms that are agreed upon, they cannot forget the hostages. And so, as we move into the coming days and weeks, my hope is that we will see an agreement that will result in the release of these hostages, and that these families will be able to be reunited with their loved ones, and that we will be able to move forward in a way that is right and just. And so with us today, we have some of these families, and I want to introduce them and let them each take the opportunity to speak. And we'll start with Yael and Adi Alexander.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We are the parents of Idan Alexander, New Jersey kid, graduated Penn High School in 2022. Dual citizen that moved to Israel same year. Good morning, everyone. Again, we are the parents of Idan Alexander, Adi Alexander, Yael Alexander, New Jersey native, Kenneth High School graduate back in 2022, moved to Israel to serve with the IDF, all-American kid, professional swimmer, still being held hostage by Hamas, and it's already half a year, 6 months since then. We have no additional information about his condition since October 7th. At this point, we think that every hostage being held there is under humanitarian. It is a humanitarian issue for everybody, for every hostage, including the Gaza citizens. Thank you for being here.
We are Berlin and Orient Neutral. We're residents of Plainview, Long Island. Our firstborn son, Omer, was born in New York City. He's an all-American kid and a proud New Yorker, born just over a month after 9/11. I clearly remember that day. I was 9 months pregnant, and I was working really close to here at UJ Federation. I remember clearly how with no transportation, I walked over the Queensboro Bridge to meet my husband on the other side of the bridge. Who could have imagined back then an attack like that on US soil? And 22 years later, Omer was kidnapped with his teammates during Hamas's vicious attack on Israel, in which they brutally raped, defiled, burned alive, and murdered close to 1,200 people, of them 44 Americans, and took hostage babies, elderly people, women and men, with no differentiation, Muslim, Jews, Christians, and Buddhists. 182 days, 6 months, I can't believe this, since Omer was stolen from us. With no sign of life, we've been experiencing the longest terrorist attack ever. What we've heard other hostages share recounts of stories of abuse, torture, and starvation. Every day, the remaining hostages, 5 of them American, draw closer to death. We're running out of time to bring them home. For 6 months, we've been screaming and pleading in their name. Here today, in New York City, 22 years later, I ask, have we learned nothing? Where is the public outcry? For all those asking for an immediate ceasefire without the release of the hostages, where is your moral compass? The call should be to Hamas to release the hostages, to put down their arms, and to allow the whole region to breathe once again. Allow the pain and the suffering to end. Releasing the hostages is a humanitarian issue. The release will ensure humanitarian aid can reach the citizens of Gaza and should bring overall de-escalation to the region. We are grateful for all the work the Biden administration has been doing to facilitate negotiations, but we are tired of hearing about progress towards a deal. We don't have time for progress. We need a resolution, a deal that would include all the hostages. By now, they are all in dire humanitarian condition. A ceasefire with no deal, or even a partial deal, could be a death sentence for our son and for the other hostages. The administration needs to pull every lever they can to pressure Qatar and Hamas and Israel to strike a deal now that brings every single hostage home, including the bodies of our loved ones who were murdered and are being held captive as well. We think about Omer every second of every day. We remember how he brought out the best in people and encouraged them to step up. And we are surrounded by a community that he built, that is fighting for him, that is not giving up on him. We won't give up on you, Omer. We love you.
Thank you for all being here. My name is Jonathan Dekelchen. I am the father of Sagi Dekelchen, a 35-year-old father of 3 little girls. And we were all asked yesterday, what keeps our hopes up as families of hostages living in a hellhole somewhere underneath Gaza? And our answer to that is a belief that one day we can get our loved ones home and the bodies of those who have already been killed by Hamas. And for me, that means Sagi coming home to his 3 little girls, an infant, a 3-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And for that, we all need help. The U.S. administration, other intermediaries, and of course, we have to deal with Hamas. We are here today, tragically, because of a chain reaction set off on October 7th by a murderous assault on southern Israel by Hamas. You've already heard about the results. For me, that also included an entire kibbutz community. Of the 134 hostages, 40 of them are from my kibbutz, from my extended family. Hamas won that day. It won that day. We, Israel, and the world must not let them win in the long term. That means that hostages have to come home. And by hostages coming home, the suffering of 1.5 million Gazans can end as well. We feel it, we know it, we weep for that kind of suffering. But as of October 7th, getting here to this moment is the tragic outcome of the kind of murder and brutality that the world shouldn't see and must not see again. For that, we ask for the help of the international community, the Biden administration, and of course, the courage of our own leaders in Israel to make the hard sacrifices in order to not sacrifice our loved ones a second time.
My name is Rachel, and I'm the mother of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, and this is John, Hirsch's father. Hirsch is a 23-year-old American-Israeli dual citizen. He is a civilian, and he was attending the Nova Music Festival before being stolen and taken into Gaza. And before that happened, his left arm, which is his dominant arm, was blown off from below the elbow. And all of us here, we all live in a different reality than normal people. And we struggle every single day to run to the ends of the earth, all of us, to get our beloved ones home. And we know for a fact that time is running out.
One of the things that we've appreciated within the support we've felt for 182 days is that political considerations among elected officials in the US have been put aside. We've had Republicans and Democrats all say, this is not a political issue. This is an issue of Americans, of hostages. We don't like anybody being held against their will. We are all working to bring them home. And we appreciate that. And I would hope that there will no longer be any political interests nor any electoral interests that influence bringing home these hostages. Bringing home the hostages should be seen as paramount, a requirement, and it must happen, and all Americans should support that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrea. My beloved sister, Judy Weinstein Chagi, and her husband, Gadi Chagi, were murdered, as you probably know, on October 7th. It took 76 days before our family learned of this. They were on their early morning walk, also residents of Kibbutz Nir Oz, and they were ambushed and shot and murdered. Since that time, we've been really wanting to know who these amazing peacenik souls are and to continue that legacy for their 4 children, for their 7 grandchildren, for my 95-year-old mother and brother and our families. Gadi was a musician, a jazz musician, a chef, and made the most amazing, delicious vegan foods like you wouldn't believe. Judy devoured it. She was light and radiant and huge amounts of compassion. She was a teacher. She made incredible puppets and taught mindfulness and taught kids to be able to use their voice through using puppetry and creativity to express themselves in a very volatile area. She wrote haiku and poetry and has all of these people have come to say what impact she had from this little place in the world that people know her all over the place, all over the world. It's incredible. These are people, and the people who were murdered and taken from us and are still being held hostage are peaceniks, are peaceful people who need to return to their family. This is what we need. We need the ceasefire. We need our hostages released, the Americans, all of the hostages. We need the fighting to stop. You know, we can only move forward in this shared humanity. We need to move forward towards peace so that generations to come can release this anger and this hatred so that we can have hope. And this morning, this earthquake, which is unbelievable, right? Mother Nature is screaming, we need to heal the earth. We need to heal this planet. We need to take this seriously. I'd like to end by sharing some writing of my sister, Judy. So she would write haiku sometimes from her safe room during military operations. And at this particular juncture, she was. So she let the audience know that if you hear bombs or hear alerts, this is why, because there are military situations going on. So she wrote, may we all be granted the basic rights of home, food, shelter, and peaceful days. Here's hoping. And here's hoping that those of us who have beloved family members who are no longer alive can return to our families and buried with their loving families so they can be laid to rest. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Rudy Chen. This is my son Roy, father of Itai Chen. I'm the local kid. I grew up here in New York City, Flatbush. Not to say from the public education system, did Yes City University. Moved to Israel a while ago, and Itai was abducted and kidnapped on that October 7th. We as well have been waiting for information since that day with no type of information whatsoever. We unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, got the news that Ty was actually killed on October 7th. And these savages decided to take his remains for being a bargaining chip for some future negotiation. I don't know if you call these types of people humans. On that day that we made the announcement, we were honored. We got phone calls back here home from congressmen, senators, Republicans, Democrats, from the Biden administration, Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan from the NSC, Vice President Harris, President Biden himself called. I told all of them more or less the same thing. The Jewish tradition, when you get that notification, you sit a Shiva. The Shiva is the Jewish tradition of a week where you mourn the deceased. And I explained to them, as I explained to the intelligent officials from Israel, we will not sit a Shiva until the time is returned back to us and put to burial as he should, as any Jew, as anyone that was protecting Israel. And we will not stop until he has brought that home to us. That is our demand. We are urging the Biden administration to understand, yes, there's no time for the living, but there's also no time for the deceased. Way out. Now's the opportunity not to just bring out the humanitarian, the living, but as well to get all the hostages out, including the deceased. And that is our ask. Thank you.
I know Congressman Goldman is, I believe, on his way. So we'll open it up to questions, and then when the congressman gets here, we'll let him offer his remarks. Yes.
I just saw some notification post. They were response to Biden's call yesterday with Netanyahu and it's asked the mayor about possible change to Israel's actions with food.
The reason we're in this situation is because of Hamas. Over the last 15 plus years, there have been at least 8 ceasefires, each time violated by Hamas. On October 7th, they indiscriminately murdered, savagely, women, children, and babies. From my perspective, Israel not only has a right to defend itself, it has a right to exist. Hamas does not believe in that right. And so, obviously, in war, there is devastation. And you try as best you can, as we have, when we are at war, to minimize the civilian and the casualties, to minimize the loss of innocent life. But I think what is important for people to remember and to recognize is that Hamas is putting innocent Palestinians in harm's way. They continue to operate out of hospitals, out of schools, and continue to use innocent Palestinians as human shields. There is always going to be mistakes and travesties in war. And obviously, I think Israel, to the best that it can, is trying to minimize that. But I think what needs to be abundantly clear to everyone is that the fastest way for a ceasefire to occur is for Hamas to surrender and to release the hostages. In the absence of releasing the hostages, I don't know how you could possibly have a ceasefire. And I think the administration needs to be very clear in its position on that. I also think the administration needs to put more pressure on the Qatari government to help get a deal done. As the families pointed out here, these negotiations have been long going, 6 months. And a lot of time has been spent saying that we're close to a deal. There needs to be a deal that includes the release of the hostages, period. And as the humanitarian efforts are underway to help innocent civilians in Gaza, those hostages must be released.
Are you, Congressman, or any the grieving families getting indications or signals from the Biden administration that a temporary ceasefire might not include the release of hostages, or is it fear?
I think some of the readouts from yesterday were a little startling in what was included or not included. And I think obviously, you know, there's been clearly a political and electoral undercurrent that has been taking shape here in the US that I think is having an impact on some of the, at least, public pronunciations. I don't think that the policy has changed insofar as they want the hostages released. I think they have made that clear. I think they need to continue to make that abundantly clear, that there will not be any decoupling of a ceasefire with the release of the hostages. The hostages must be released. You have American families, American citizens who have been impacted by this. That must be at the forefront of our minds and our efforts in trying to bring this conflict to a resolution. If you want to, yes, please.
Well, I think that's a perfectly legitimate question. I would respond by saying that as an Israeli American, which I am, and all of our loved ones are, and most of us are ourselves, it's been extraordinary these past 6 months. The complete solidarity and support that we've felt from the Biden administration. Of course, the administration is perfectly capable and has the responsibility of acting in the best interests of the United States. At the end of the day, however, nothing has happened, at least in my opinion, over the last 24 or 48 hours to in any way make me think that the conviction of the Biden administration that we have heard clearly and been shown during our meetings towards the release of all of the hostages, all 134 of the hostages, has changed even a little. And I think I can speak in this case for all of us. We've all been struck by the respect and access that we've been granted by the Biden administration in general as hostage families. And sadly, I have to say, it is in direct contrast to the same kind of access that we have not really been given by our own government. So those are the realities of the situation. And so one can go out of one's way to interpret a readout in this or that way, but that's all it is. It's a readout. And the facts are complete support to the Biden administration up to now, and there is no reason to believe that that's changed.
Contrast Brian, the Biden administration
And the Israeli government, correct. I'm sad to say, does not give me any sense of joy or pride, but that is, those are the facts on the ground.
Yeah, we do.
And I'll just add another sentence about yesterday. So the Biden administration is very swift and demanding investigation about what happened with the international volunteers, workers. And I think all of us should applaud that decisiveness. I would just go back and point out to the fact that on October 7th, 44 US citizens were killed on that day. And I would believe that the Biden administration should act as swiftly as decisive to Qatar, demanding the same type of investigation for the U.S. citizens that were killed and bringing them to justice. Why is that not happening? Why are the deceased U.S. citizens not getting that same type of justice? I would ask the president to maybe put some effort into that as well. Yeah, my hours.
We've had too many of these press conferences. We've had too many of these gatherings for these families that are struggling, that are devastated, that are completely in the dark about what is going on with their loved ones who have now been held hostage for 6 months without any wellness checks, without any proof of life, without any of the requirements for prisoners of war or hostages by international law. And there's plenty of attention, and there should be, on the humanitarian issues and concerns that are going on in Gaza, and to what extent Israel is playing a role. But it is beyond me why there is so little attention put on Hamas to release illegally captured, tortured, potentially raped hostages who are innocent civilians. If there's going to be a ceasefire of some sort, a stop, a pause, whatever you want to call it, to allow for the hostages to be released, then we need 2 parties to agree. Yes, of course, Israel has to agree, but so does Hamas. And we cannot continue to have these meetings, these gatherings, continue to ask these families who are suffering so much to stand up again and again, just to remind this country and the world that their loved ones remain in captivity, held by a terrorist organization. And you tell me one other time in our history that Americans have been held hostage by a terrorist group and nobody pays attention. Nobody seems to care. And yes, I certainly hear far more from folks advocating for a permanent ceasefire. And every time someone comes up to me and says, why don't you demand a permanent ceasefire? I ask them, well, what should happen to the hostages? Now, they all say, well, of course the hostages should be released. Israel does not control the hostages. Israel cannot release the hostages. So it is long past time that every single country in the world, in the UN, in the EU, in the Arab League, every single country needs to be calling out Hamas to release the hostages. I am tired of the ICRC saying that there's only a political solution here. The ICRC's job is to make sure that prisoners of war and captives are healthy according to international humanitarian law. Their job is not to negotiate a political release. And yet we have British government officials threatening to withhold aid to Israel if Israel does not allow the ICRC in to check on the arrested Hamas terrorists. Yet there's no call for the ICRC to check on these families' loved ones. It is long past time that the world rises up, led by the United States, and demands that Hamas release the hostages right now. And if there are countries that have connections to Hamas, then we need to ratchet up the pressure on those countries to put pressure on Hamas to do the right and just thing, to do the thing that international law requires. This war would end today if Hamas released the hostages and surrendered their arms. It would be over today because a terrorist group attacked Israel and innocent civilians during a previous permanent ceasefire, brutally, horrifically killed many, tortured others, raped others. That's why this started. And Hamas can end it today. So I am here sick and tired of having to see these people who have become, unfortunately, and I say that not because I don't love them, I do, but unfortunately my friends now, having to stand up and plead for somebody to pay attention to the fact that their loved ones, American citizens, are being held hostage in brutal conditions by a terrorist organization. And it is time that the United States, every other country around the world, stands up to terrorism, stands up for democracy, and demands that our loved ones are returned today.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to make sure to point out that sometimes what gets lost in all the noise is that among the 134 hostages who still remain in Gaza, they represent 25 different nations. They very rarely does anyone talk about the 8 Muslim Arab hostages who were taken on October 7th, who are currently also being still held there. You very rarely hear anyone advocating for the 7 young men from Thailand who are Buddhist, who were also taken hostage on October 7th. You rarely hear about the Mexican, Nepalese, and Portuguese hostages who were taken on that day. And I think that it is very important to recognize that these people are not a monolithic group, that this is an extremely diverse group of people who are being held, and that different religions, as we know, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, who range in age from 14 months is the youngest hostage, Kfir Bibas, up until the age of 86. And I hope that that doesn't get lost in the noise.
Any other questions?
I would welcome anyone to speak about how they think American sentiment has shifted in the past 6 months or more recently. It does feel like there's been a turning point.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's an appropriate question. There's been a huge shift. There's no question. And how, I think, I'll just speak for myself, but how could there not be? The devastation in Gaza it's so tremendous. The starvation, the destruction, the illness, the death. We see it every day on the news. We hear about it every day. How could people of conscience not feel that something has to happen? There needs to be a ceasefire, and that you'd be inhuman if you weren't. And I do think that there's been a big shift, not just in the United States, but across the world. The shock of October 7th the images have faded, you know, in relation to the images in Gaza and the shock about what's going on in Gaza. That's real. And I was thinking about this as I was listening to people speaking, and I was listening to Rachel just now. You know, but one thing I'd like to say about it is, it doesn't matter if you believe that Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization, as we all do, or you believe that they're freedom fighters trying to liberate their people. Which I think there's a huge sentiment about that, and we can't deny it, right, in the US and across the world, but it doesn't matter, because 134 innocent people are still hostages. They are still there. They have nothing to do with that. They are still being held captive in these brutal conditions. This is still happening. So I guess that's what I think we all want to make sure is imprinted on everyone and doesn't get lost, is that we can't stop that tide. It's real. It's happening. And there are many reasons for that public opinion to be shifting and to still hold that humanity, that there's no reason that those hostages should still be captive. So.
I want to add something. It is very important to be able to view some of these issues in isolation. The humanitarian crisis that has unfolded as a consequence of the war is separate from the ultimate objective of the war effort, and is separate from a discussion about the hostages, about Hamas, about what Israel's right to self-defense. And I think what the president expressed to Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday was an emphasis on Israel's approach to the humanitarian crisis, and that it is insufficient. And that is true. But that does not mean that Israel's right to defend itself does not exist. It does not mean that Israel does not have the right to defend itself by attacking Hamas if Hamas will not surrender and will not return the hostages. So we need to keep those two concepts separate. And there's no question that Israel has a responsibility because of their military operation to provide aid and food to the civilians in Gaza who have been displaced and are now refugees. But Hamas also needs to stop this war and recognize that they are continuing the destruction and the violence by holding on to hostages and bodies that they are treating terribly.
I'll just say a few thoughts on this. In the aftermath of October 7th, President Bush said that the world stands with Israel in the aftermath, but the moment they defend themselves, the world will turn. And we have seen that. We have seen that across the globe. We've seen that here in the United States. Not everyone. But it is an understanding of the challenge that Israel faces. When you are dealing in a world and in an area of the world in which certain countries don't believe in your right to exist. Certain countries would like to eradicate you and eliminate your right to practice your faith. And so there's a lot going on here. These are not just, in one silo. There's a lot of factors at play here. And yes, the humanitarian aspect of it is important. And yes, we want to make sure that innocent Palestinians are not being harmed. But that is also up to Hamas. And again, all of this could end very quickly if Hamas would surrender and release the hostages. And from my perspective, that is the fastest way for this to end and the cleanest way for this to end. And that is where the world should be putting their pressure on. The call should be for Hamas to surrender and release the hostages. Okay, we're gonna wrap up at this time. I want to thank AJC for hosting us. I want to thank all of the families for being here, and my colleague in government, Dan Goldman, for joining us. And thank you all for being here to honor these families and to highlight the situation that their loved ones continue to endure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.